Now, back to the United States. Achieving racial justice has been one of the biggest challenges for America. For many in social justice movements, the only way to fight racial discrimination, especially in politics, is to voice the disparities loud and clear. For instance, creating public policies specifically targeted to alleviate injustices faced by the black community. But some people disagree. Like my next guest, he's the author of the New York Times article, Fighting Racism Quietly. In it, he claims that the Ahmaud Arbery trial exemplifies an effective way to battle racism by downplaying race and appealing to the universal ideas of justice. To discuss this and much more is the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and senior writer at the New York Times, David Leonhardt. David, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to Black News Tonight. You start your article by mentioning how the prosecutor in the Ahmaud Arbery trial was successful, my pleasure, because she didn't make the case about race. Do you think she had, if she had done otherwise, would she have lost the case? Why is this important?
I think we don't know. It's impossible to rerun history and be sure about it. But this is a very experienced prosecutor who thought a lot about what gave her the best chance to win the case. I think it's notable that Ahmaud Arbery's family was extremely happy with how she handled the prosecution, and they were happy about how she handled it even before the verdict came in. And I think what we know is that this was not an easy case, right? There were facts that were inconvenient for the prosecution in this case. There were uncertainties about exactly what was going on. And so she looked at the details and she said, look, I don't want to go in there and remind this jury, which was nearly all white. I don't want to go in and first get them thinking about race. I am in the South. It's possible that some members of this jury, they may have themselves Confederate symbols from old Georgia flags in their homes, on their cars. I don't want to get them thinking, hey, I'm a white person. Maybe I'm very conservative. Maybe I think there's too much accusation of racism in this country. Instead, I want to appeal to universal notions of justice. And so she really played down race. She mentioned it a single time in her closing argument. And what she instead said to the jury is, look, this was deeply unfair. These people did not have to kill Ahmaud Arbery. They could have let him go at any point and just let this incident sort of just pass on. And instead, they took it to the next level, and they went looking for trouble, and they killed him. And so I think we know that what she did worked. We know that it wasn't that easy a case. We know that winning convictions against white people in America for killing black people is shamefully difficult to do. And so when you sort of put that all together, I think it is fair to consider her strategy highly successful. I also think it's fair to note that it was criticized while she was doing it. And then we can kind of talk about, well, are there any larger lessons there?
So at the core, your article is hinging upon this idea that society still has issues addressing race head on, and really white people have an issue talking about race head on. First, let's get to the why. Why is that?
So I don't think it's just white people. I mean, look, we have a terrible history of racism in our country. That's no secret. We also are a country where huge numbers of people have been struggling over the last few decades. When you look at measures like median income, when you look at measures like life expectancy, when you look at things like are people satisfied with how things are going in the country, all of these measures really have showed stagnation over the last generation or so. And so I think one of the things that happens politically is when you go forward and you say to working class people, no matter what their race, if you say to any group of working class people, hey, you're really privileged right now, their reaction may be some version of, what are you talking about? I'm not privileged. And I think that helps explain why, for example, when affirmative action was on the ballot in California, a very blue state, it lost badly. And it didn't just lose in white neighborhoods. Huge numbers of Latino and Asian American voters, small number of African American voters, but huge numbers of Latino and Asian American voters voted against affirmative action in California. And so given that we have these terrible racial gaps in this country, on anything, income, education, wealth, we can't ever overcome them with only universal policies. So I'm not saying this is a complete answer, but we can make a huge amount of progress, say on child poverty, with something like a universal child tax credit, because it is going to disproportionately benefit lower income people, which is going to have a disproportionate benefit in closing the racial gap. I don't know if that policy is better or not than a race-specific policy to close the racial gap. I am highly confident that a universal policy like that is much more likely to actually happen.
So you raised some interesting points. I have some concerns and critiques of this approach, but I want to begin by saying I appreciated the way that you threaded the needle in this piece. You weren't saying, and I want to be clear so my audience understands this, you weren't saying, hey, if you want racial justice, don't talk about race. You were saying that this has to be another tool in our toolkit. Right. You're saying this would be another tool in our toolkit, and that, sometimes you have to take a different approach. In the Ahmaud Arbery jury trial is an example of that. By not invoking race explicitly, they were able to get an outcome that benefits everybody. I get that. And I see the value in that. And I think that that's what, black activists, black organizers, black movements have always attempted to do. Sometimes we whiten the face of poverty to make it real. Look at Bobby Kennedy with the war on poverty. If you look at Jesse Jackson with the Rainbow Coalition, he wanted to help black folk, but he understood that if we were red, yellow, black, and white, we're all precious in God's sight, that the world may have a different response. So I get that. My concern, though, is that this tactic can also ultimately concede that white people will never be willing, or at least non-black people will not be willing to talk about anti-black racism or to deal with it, and that we should always play to their anxieties and fears rather than forcing them to wrestle with something. For example, in the case of Ahmaud Arbery was killed because he was black. And so it's very difficult to say, well, look, as long as these racist white jurors, potentially racist white jurors, don't have to confront his blackness in order to see his humanity, we're good. I'm wondering if we can ultimately have a humane or a just public policy or criminal legal system or anything else, educational system, anything else, if that's the concession we have to make.
I don't know whether we can have a fully just society if that's the concession. I guess the question I would ask you is, if you think huge numbers of people in our society are unwilling to grapple with race, and we live in a democracy, how do you see that it is possible to make progress if so many people are unwilling to grapple with it? That's sort of what I wonder.
No, it's a great question. And so I would think back to some of the activism that we saw on the ground in the 1960s. If in 1963 we had a public vote to pull up this democratic idea that you point to for public accommodations or for the Voting Rights Act, of course, we'd lose, right? But you fight on the ground and you sway public opinion through other tactics. Similarly, I would say, yeah, in a democracy where people are reluctant to take this stuff head on, we may not be able to do it through majority opinion, but there might be other ways that we can push the public sentiment through the books we write, through the articles we write, through the teachings and the political education we engage in, through the media that we present, so that slowly but surely we shift public opinion so that we don't have to not view our blackness to see our humanity. And I know you're not saying that. I'm just saying that seems to be the ultimate concession we might have to make. And I'd be fine to do it if I thought it would work. But I don't want to be in an end game where not only are we not talking about race, but we're still not getting the convictions. We're still not getting the education. We're still not getting the housing, etc. I'm going to give you the final word, though.
That's a fair point. I mean, the two things I would say are, look, the civil rights movement did use both of these tools, right? Obviously, the civil rights movement used race-specific tools. That's what it was built around. But central to that movement were also labor unions, right? Martin Luther King was killed participating in a strike in Memphis. A. Philip Randolph, one of the most important civil rights pioneers of the 20th century, was predominantly a labor union organizer. And so there was an understanding that fighting for broad-based economic gains across races was a vital part of what the civil rights movement is. And I would argue that that same approach continues to be valuable for social change. I also think there's a short-term, long-term problem here. I mean, if you look at Obamacare, for example, Obamacare closed a lot of racial gaps in health insurance access. I would argue that that is a very good thing. I don't think it could have gotten passed if it had been sold as predominantly a racial justice program, right? I'm sure Barack Obama himself would make that case. And so there's a short-term, long-term issue here. In the long term, I agree with you. We can never get to a racially just society by ignoring race in the long term. In the short term, sometimes you face a trial. And would it have been better for the Ahmaud Arbery prosecution to lose that trial but make race central to the case, or win the trial and remove race from much of it? And I think imagine you're the prosecutor and you face that choice. You don't know, but you think you hurt your chances of winning the case by making it all about race. Do you still do it? I think your job there is to win a conviction. And then you live to fight another day on some of these long-term issues.
That's an interesting philosophical question as well. I'm going to have you back so we can unpack that further, because that's a great question. I probably would say, I might just, not having thought this through, because you just raised it, it might be worth it to lose and have the whole country see how dysfunctional this criminal legal system is, and that may lead to bigger gains, sort of like, the staging a sit-in on the Pettus Bridge, or all these other moments where we know that America's cruelty and failure to take the race issue directly on, it touches our souls. I mean, George Floyd dying is what got so much of this conversation going, right? So it could be an interesting way to think about that too. Anyway, so much to talk about. I got to run, but David, wonderful article. Thank you for stoking our thoughts, and please come back.